In the dimming light of dusk, the forest lay silent, dense and suffocating. Ancient trees towered above, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers, as if forever frozen in a silent scream. The air was thick with a damp, earthy scent mixed with the faint, iron tang of something unnatural, something darkly familiar, hanging in the atmosphere. This forest had earned a name that echoed fear in every whispered tale of the nearby village. The last breath woods. They said the woods were cursed, that each night, a strange fog crept between the trees, swallowing the forest floor whole. And if anyone dared to wander in during the night, they'd hear it, the rustling of leaves, not from any wind, but from something moving, something alive. There were rumors of an ancient force buried deep within, something primal and hungry that had awakened long ago and never been satisfied. Only the bravest, or the most foolish, ventured close to those trees once the sun began its descent. But for Marcus, a thrill-seeker and skeptic, the tales were nothing more than superstition. "It's just trees," he muttered to himself, adjusting his flashlight. He was here to prove the village wrong, to show them that the woods held no real power, no curse. With each step, he moved further from the safety of the village, further from the familiar, until even the faintest hum of civilization was gone, replaced only by the silence of the forest, an unnerving, heavy silence that weighed on his chest. The ground squelched beneath his feet, damp from the afternoon rain, and with each step, the mud seemed to grab onto his shoes, almost as if trying to pull him down. Shadows stretched and danced as he passed through, but he told himself it was nothing, just tricks of the light, his imagination getting the better of him. But there was something else there, something too real to ignore. The first sound he heard was a soft, muffled sob. He stopped, holding his breath, straining to listen. The cry came again, low and drawn out, fading into a wet, guttural rasp. Marcus turned his flashlight towards the sound, but the beam was swallowed up by the fog, which seemed to thicken with every passing moment. It seeped in through the trees, coiling around him, growing colder and heavier. He called out, his voice barely carrying, "Hello? Is anyone there?" His words were met with silence. Then, the whisper of footsteps, slow and measured, as if someone, or something, was deliberately circling him. The temperature dropped, and his breath began to mist in the air. He could feel the damp coldness seeping into his bones, his skin prickling as a chill traced its way down his spine. The sobbing stopped, but now there was a different noise, one that sent a jolt of fear through him, a low, rumbling growl, echoing from deep within the shadows. He took a step back, his flashlight flickering, struggling against the dark. And then he saw it, a figure, barely visible through the fog, but enough to make out its outline. It stood crookedly, its limbs too long, hanging at unnatural angles. Dark stains covered its figure, dripping down its arms and pulling at its feet. The stench hit him before he could process what he was seeing, a metallic, rotten scent that filled his lungs, making him gag. The figure lurched forward, its eyes empty and hollow, black pits that seemed to draw in all light, all hope. It reached out a bony hand, its fingers long and clawed, dripping with a red so dark it was almost black. Marcus tried to scream, but no sound came out. His voice had been stolen, caught in his throat as his body froze in terror. And then he heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the wind, barely audible yet undeniably sinister. Welcome, traveler, breathe deeply. This is your last breath. The fog thickened, curling tighter around him, pressing down on his chest, making each breath harder, more painful, until it felt like the forest itself was devouring him, drinking in his fear, his final gasps. And in those final moments, as his vision blurred and the world dimmed, he could swear he saw hundreds of hollow eyes staring back at him from the shadows, each one a reminder of those who had come before him, who had given their last breath to the forest. As Marcus felt his vision dimming, the surrounding pressure grew unbearable, as if invisible hands were squeezing the air out of his lungs. His legs buckled, and he fell to his knees, gasping, clawing at the fog that clung to him like a shroud. Shadows closed in, swallowing the slivers of fading light. Yet in that overwhelming darkness, his senses sharpened. He became intensely aware of the things moving around him, an endless choir of faint, whispering voices, distorted, writhing within the fog like trapped souls. "Please, I didn't mean," he choked, his voice a weak rasp as he struggled to form words. But the forest didn't care. Its only answer was the scraping of those unseen things, dragging themselves closer, inch by inch, like nails scratching across cold, wet stone. The shadowy figure that had first appeared to him was no longer alone. Others began to emerge from the darkness, all twisted and elongated, their empty eyes fixed on him, their faces hollow and expressionless, like warped, decaying masks. Each one looked like a distorted reflection of a person, a child, an elderly man, a woman in a tattered dress. Yet they all bore the same emptiness, the same unending hunger. They hovered around him, waiting, as if savoring his fear, drinking in the terror that radiated from him in waves. One of the figures, a woman with a gaping, jagged mouth that stretched far too wide, leaned closer, her eyes glinting in the faint, ghastly light. Her breath was cold against his face, sharp and metallic. "You, the next offering," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice, her fingers brushing against his skin like icicles. Her touch left a burning sting, as if she were marking him, sealing his fate with that faint, deadly caress. Panic surged through him, igniting one last flicker of strength. With a guttural scream, he staggered to his feet, his vision spinning as he stumbled backward. He turned, bolting through the forest, his feet slipping in the mud, branches slashing across his face, leaving shallow cuts that burned with a searing cold. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let them take him. Behind him, the sound of dragging footsteps grew louder, faster, as if the shadows themselves had come alive, ravenous and relentless. He didn't dare look back. He knew that if he did, he'd see them. Those empty eyes, those twisted, hungry faces. The fog seemed to thicken, clinging to him, trying to slow him down, as if the forest itself wanted him to stay. The trees loomed closer, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for him, tangling in his hair, ripping at his clothes. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, his breaths coming in short, desperate gasps. Every step became a struggle, his legs heavy as lead, his mind clouded with a creeping, numbing exhaustion. It was as if the very air was poisoned, draining his strength, pulling him down into a suffocating embrace. Just as he thought he'd collapse, the fog began to part, revealing a small clearing up ahead, bathed in a pale, sickly glow. In the center of the clearing stood an altar of stone, covered in deep, crimson stains that glistened like fresh blood. Bones lay scattered around it, cracked and splintered, as if gnawed on by some ravenous creature. The stench of decay was overwhelming, a putrid smell that made his stomach churn. He stopped, staring at the altar, an ancient dread filling him as he realized where he was. The villagers' stories flooded back into his mind. The whispers of sacrifices, of rituals performed under the blood moon, of the forest's insatiable hunger for life. This was the heart of the woods, the place where countless others had breathed their last. And then he saw her. A figure stood on the other side of the altar, draped in a tattered cloak that seemed to blend with the darkness. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, but he could feel her gaze on him, piercing, as cold as death itself. She lifted one bony hand, beckoning him forward, her fingers curling in a slow, deliberate motion. Come closer." Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it echoed through the clearing, filling his mind with a paralyzing dread. He tried to resist, tried to turn away, but his feet moved of their own accord, carrying him toward her, drawn by an unseen force that pulled at his very soul. As he reached the altar, she lowered her hood, revealing a face that was neither young nor old, a face that seemed to shift and change, as if haunted by 1,000 tormented souls. Her eyes were dark pits, filled with an endless void, and her mouth twisted into a chilling smile. "Do you know why you're here, Marcus?" she asked, her voice soft and venomous. He shook his head, his body trembling, his voice barely a whisper. I don't understand." She leaned closer, her gaze burning into him, her smile widening. You were chosen. The forest calls to those who don't fear it, those who dare to challenge its power. But now, you'll pay the price for your arrogance. With a flick of her wrist, she gestured to the surrounding shadows, and the twisted figures began to move, closing in, their hands outstretched, their eyes glinting with a terrifying hunger. He could feel their cold fingers brushing against him, pulling him down to his knees, pinning him against the cold stone of the altar. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was a face, smiling as she leaned down, whispering in his ear, "This is the forest's last breath, and it's yours." Marcus's scream echoed into the void as the twisted figures pinned him against the cold stone altar. Their claws bit into his flesh, drawing thin lines of blood that seeped into the grooves of the ancient stone, mingling with the dark stains of countless others who had come before him. His muscles strained, but the hands that held him down were unnaturally strong, like iron shackles. The woman in the tattered cloak loomed over him, her hollow eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. She held out her hand, and from within the folds of a cloak, she drew a blade, a jagged, ancient thing, blackened with rust and age. The moonlight caught on its edge, casting a faint, sickly gleam that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Your blood will awaken the forest," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with a terrible finality. "It will feed the roots, breathe life into the soil, and keep our land alive until the next offering." Marcus thrashed against his captors, his heart racing, his mind racing with the desperation of prey caught in a trap. "Please, no," he gasped, his voice raw and choked with terror. But his pleas only seemed to amuse her. She tilted her head, studying him with a look of mock pity. "The forest does not listen to mercy," she murmured, tracing the blade along his chest, pressing it just enough to break the skin. Blood welled up, warm and dark, trickling down his skin in a thin, glistening line. "It only knows hunger, and you, Marcus, will satisfy it." As she raised the blade high above him, Marcus felt his spirit slipping away, each beat of his heart slower, each breath harder to draw. The fog seemed to thicken, swirling around him, filling his lungs, pressing down on his chest. And then, just as he thought he'd lost himself entirely, he heard something, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was a voice, gentle and soft, different from the mocking chorus that had surrounded him. "Fight, resist, asterisk." The woman hesitated, her face twisting with a flash of fury, as if she'd sensed the intrusion. But Marcus felt a flicker of hope. With a sudden surge of strength, he twisted his body, wrenching himself free of the claws that held him. His arm lashed out, knocking the knife from her hand. It clattered against the altar, a sharp, metallic echo in the suffocating silence. The woman's eyes widened, her face contorting with rage. "You think you can escape?" she hissed, her voice echoing through the clearing with a deadly venom. "The forest is everywhere, and you are nothing but prey." But Marcus wasn't listening. He stumbled to his feet, his head spinning, his limbs heavy and numb, yet driven by a raw, desperate will to survive. He darted toward the edge of the clearing, his breath ragged, his pulse pounding in his ears. The twisted figures shrieked in fury, lunging after him, their clawed hands reaching out, but he pushed forward, tearing himself free from their grasp. The trees closed in around him, their branches swaying, shifting as though alive, blocking his path, forcing him to weave and dodge, fighting his way through the dense undergrowth. The fog chased him, swirling like a living thing, thickening, pressing closer. But he ran, ignoring the branches that scratched his face, the roots that snagged at his feet, the pain that burned through his body. Ahead of him, through the tangled darkness, he caught a glimpse of light, a faint, golden glow. It was the edge of the forest, freedom. With a final, desperate burst of energy, he lunged toward the light, his heart racing, his vision narrowing as exhaustion threatened to pull him down. Just as the fog closed in around him, he broke through the tree line, stumbling into the open air. The cold night breeze hit his face, sharp and bracing, filling his lungs with clean, fresh air. He fell to his knees, gasping, his body shaking, but he was free. Behind him, the forest loomed, dark and silent, the fog retreating, pulling back like a tide. He could feel the weight of its gaze, feel the ancient, malevolent presence lurking within the trees. But it did not cross the line. It lingered at the edge, watching, waiting. The village lay in the distance, its lights flickering like stars in the darkness. Marcus rose on unsteady legs, his mind numb with shock, his body aching with exhaustion. As he stumbled toward the village, he heard a faint, echoing whisper behind him, a voice carried on the night wind. We will wait. Marcus, the forest is patient. He shivered, feeling the weight of those words, a promise that echoed in his bones. The forest would wait. It would lure others, draw them in, one by one, to feed its endless hunger. And he knew that, in some dark, twisted way, he would never truly escape. He would always feel its pull, always remember the hollow eyes and twisted shadows that had nearly claimed him. And as he crossed the threshold of the village, he knew that the tale he'd share would become part of the legend, a warning to others who might dare to challenge the forest. But deep down, he knew the truth. No one would listen. The forest's last breath was never truly the last. It was only waiting for the next.